Hi guys, it's Ivy, and today I'm here with a step-by-step tutorial on how I do these animated illustrations. The programs I'll be using today are Procreate, Adobe Photoshop, Dragonbones, and Adobe After Effects. Most of these effects can be done with freeware. Dragonbones is where we're going to be doing the bulk of the animating, which is a freeware software, and it's not covered very often, so that's why I wanted to make this video to kind of cover the people that maybe can't afford programs like Spine. It's time consuming, but not very difficult, so let's get into it. First, I just want to do a quick step-by-step of my process for creating the illustration part of this. So the first thing I do is create kind of a compositional sketch to get an idea of what I want the space to be like and where I want things to lay. The next thing I do is go into Design Doll, which is another free program, and create a 3D scene. I also generate two kinds of lighting for this, so I have some ideas of where the shadows are going to be. I use that 3D scene to create my sketch. And while I'm doing this for this process, I'm being extremely mindful about what is going to be the background, midground, and foreground, and how those layers are going to be broken up, because that is really important for this particular process. Then I do a color study and sort of figure out what vibe I'm going for mood-wise. And in this process, I'm also breaking up these different layers, and I'll show you visually what I mean. Here I've broken up the foreground, midground, and background really distinctly, so I have shapes already established for what those spaces are going to be. That's going to make coloring those individually a lot easier. I've exported my Procreate time-lapse video for you guys to see. For the most part, I am using Max Packs as my brushes, specifically the gouache set, which I really like. And I also am a really big fan of the mechanical pencil from the comic set. So if you're looking for some new Procreate brushes, I really would definitely recommend those sets. I wasn't really planning to render the whole thing in Procreate, but I just got going and then the style was consistent and it was actually really easy. I have a hard time being very spatially aware in Procreate, so it can be hard for me to create a base there, but actually pulling something from the PC that was like a really solid base and bringing that over to my iPad and rendering there worked out really well. By the way, please do not say anything about how the holes do not line up on the, what do you call it, pegboard? Please don't say anything. I know, it drives me crazy. I don't want to think about it. I'm keeping my layers as I go through this, so note that the background never gets painted over. They stay separate. Everything stays separate, and that's just going to make the animating part much easier. You can go over later and paint in the parts that were covered, but it's a lot easier if you just start with the base that doesn't have that. So here is my finished illustration. I also render it kind of in its own way for printing and all that stuff. I do that first. And sometimes I have to strip away effects to get to the animating part and sort of keep in mind that I have to re-add those later because they might not fit if they're a lighting or a filter after. I just kind of have to keep in mind that there will probably be a print version and one that you can animate. Alright, so now we're back in Photoshop to do the separating. You don't need Photoshop to do this part. I'm going to show you what we're aiming for, and then I'll sort of show you how I get there. So basically, Dragonbones will import a PSD with all of the layers in sort of the correct spot that they were in Photoshop in the original PSD. It will make every layer into its own individual PNG, and that's what you're seeing here. So basically what we're going to want to do is break apart every section that needs its own animation. For one simple example, let's say you have a branch that is swinging. You need to make sure that the area underneath the branch doesn't include the branch. It's a blank slate. So when the branch moves, you'll just see the background behind it. So you might need to be separating things and then painting underneath sort of what would be there if that item wasn't there, if you haven't broken your layers apart completely. All right, this first one that I'm doing here, I cheated a little bit because I already had a selection in the shape of it, so all I really have to do is clean it up. But this next one I'm doing is more of a standard approach. So I take my selection tool and I'm just kind of going along the outside of this little branch flower hanging thing, dried flowers that I know I want to be moving. And I'm gonna select both this one and the one next to it and just kind of bundle them together. I think that it would be fine if they move kind of at the same rate. So I'm just making a selection of the shape, and then I will be cleaning up the edges so that the alpha or the opacity around it is really clean. I use layer masks to do a lot of this kind of cleanup on the edge part because I still want it to have a painterly effect, and it's easier to use brushes on a layer mask than it is to just use a selection for this particular style. Once I sort of have the outline of the layer done, or the layer mask is satisfactory, you can see in this example, the bucket of the other plant is still on this layer. So basically I'm going to need to repaint that plant underneath it so when that bucket moves, you're not seeing the, the bucket showing underneath. So that's the really basic principle. Like I said, this process is not hard, it's just very time consuming. So basically I'm going to need to rinse and repeat for every individual item that I want to be animated and move on its own. Most of these items in the rafters are really easy because I just want them to swing. So they don't really need anything too complicated about breaking them apart. They can pretty much just sit on their own because I don't need them to bend or anything like that. But if you do, you might need to break these individual items into even more individual pieces. I'm also sure to test my edges with different background colors. So here I've changed it to black and I'm going over the ones that I have already done to see the edges that I might have missed that were too light or anything. You really want each layer to be able to stand on its own for a smooth animation. The most annoying part, no doubt, is repainting all of the underside of all this stuff, like the background in this case, that needs to be on its own underneath these individual items that will be in front of it. This really does need to be done and very cleanly because it will show. So something to keep in mind. It's really worth pre-planning the different layers for the majority of it, where you'll be stuck repainting backgrounds for the whole time, and nobody wants to do that. The rest of this section is just going to be show, not really tell. I've pretty much given my tips, and the rest is just separating things and repainting things. So feel free to watch if you need to see how any part of it is done, or go ahead and skip to the next section if you feel ready. Alright, it's time to import everything into Dragonbones, or at least prep for it. One thing I'll say before I get into anything else is that you can always edit these PNGs, or like the thing that they give you after you import it into Dragonbones. So it's not like, oh, I've imported it and now I can never touch those layers again. You can always go back and edit them, and I've even added layers into this one and stuff because I did not start with the eyes moving. That was all added later. So it's good to know that you can go back to things if you feel the need to, but for now I'm going to prep to import things into Dragonbones. So first of all, I do not want this file size to be quite as massive as it started out. The original print is like really big. I don't even know how big it is, but it's like way more than you would ever need in an animation. So I'm going to size it down. It's still very large for an animation, but I wanted it to be at least as wide as a typical 1920 screen. So I've sized it down. And then I want to go through and rename all of my layers. Now this isn't necessary, but it does really help with organizing and finding things. Just naming your layers when you have this many, and they aren't going to be grouped or anything in Dragonbones, so it's good to know what things are at first glance and not have to always like pull up the preview. So that's the first step. Another good thing to do is just make sure that all your layers are clean and you're not including any hidden layers or anything like that. Make sure that you make another save file that is separate for this project very specifically. You wouldn't want to save over any kind of your important original work. So maybe keep another folder or something so you keep everything on its own. And then once you're ready, you just save it as a standard PSD with everything formatted at the right layers, and it should be really easy to import that PSD into Dragonbones. Now, one little issue I had with this one was that the background was too big, so I had to keep breaking it up into other sections and just letting it import that way. But we're good, we got it. So in Dragonbones, what you're going to want to do is go create a new project. It will be an animation, and make that under Armature template. From there, you're going to want to go to File and Import Assets to Stage. Select your PSD, and you should be able to just let it import with default settings. And it will take a while to load probably, but then you'll have your PSD in there, and hopefully it will have the layers in all the right spots. This should be what you see with all of the images on the screen highlighted probably. And what we're going to want to do is create bones for each area that we need animated. So sort of like how we had to separate everything that we wanted animated, now we have to assign a bone to it, which is going to tell it how to move. Okay, so there's two ways that we are mainly going to be moving things in this image. One is a basic rotation pose, so that's just moving a bone, and the other is using an IK constraint to move multiple bones. Mostly I just use the rotation, and that's probably like 95% of how I move things, but I'm going to teach you how to do both. So first of all, I'm going to hide the foreground so that we can just edit the midground and isolate a certain area. So how you hide things is on this right panel, and there will be like a little dot underneath an eye, and that will hide and reveal things. So I'm just going to hide all these plants in the foreground so we can actually see what we're looking at. So I'm going to start this off by just animating this arm. This is an easy one to start with because the mesh part of it isn't going to come into play a whole lot because there are 3 different broken up parts. I will teach you how to do the mesh part, but this is just going to be showing you kind of the basic introduction of how a bone works. So your tools are on the top right. I'm going to start by just isolating these 3 layers. So with the select tool, I'm just going to control click these 3 images. And then on the right panel, I'm going to right click that and hit hide others so we can isolate just those 3. Now we're going to create bones for these 3 images. So I'm going to go up to this create bone tool and I will start where the shoulder joint is and I'll just click and drag from there and create a bone. Now by default, we'll have a connection when we create the next one because that bone is automatically selected. Then I'm just going to rinse and repeat for the forearm and the wrist joints. Now this will connect by default to the image or layer that you kind of draw the bone on top of. So we can see that this little image has been connected to this bone, and they've all done that, but there are some instances where it might not select the right one, or it won't select any, or whatever. And it might be a good idea in that case to move the image off of it. You can just drag it up to root again, and it will be on its own. It won't be connected to the bone. But it was fine how it was. It selected the right ones, so it's actually all right. And it should already start actually to pose according to these bones. So here, you can see what I mean by this, okay? It has a little rotation now because it is connected. So you're already going to be able to do some stuff with this, but you're also going to run into some troubles with areas that you might want to stretch or contract, or it would be affected by multiple bones. In this particular instance, I want this sleeve, when I pull this out, I want this sleeve to stretch. So it should be actually connected to this bone. This part of it should drag over as this bone moves. So what we have to do for this is create a mesh and weights on this image. So that would be this one. This is the sleeve. So you would select this, and over here on the left, you would go to mesh and then edit mesh. And it isn't going to do anything just yet, but it will bring up this little panel where you can change the vertices. So we're going to create some vertices. And if you've ever done any kind of 3D stuff, it's basically creating a 3D mesh for this to move along. I'm actually going to hide these other 2. So it's kind of giving it a base of where to stretch and contract. So I usually go around the edges first, kind of give it a base. And then I also might go around parts of how I want it to stretch. So we're going around this. This is like a section that I would want to move. Maybe not that part. And then let's see, maybe right here up the arm. And again here. So it might take some practice to figure out where these should be. I'm also not perfect at it, but I've done a little bit. Okay, so now we kind of have a mesh, so these points will move with the bones once we assign weights to them. So to do that, we have to get out of edit mesh and we are going to add bone to bind. So we're going to click this. It says, please select bind bones. And you would just click on this bone. So now we have this left arm bone added. And again, for this one, because we want it dictated by these 2. So we have this. Now we can auto generate weights. Let's see what that does. All right. I'm gonna show these 2. Oh, you know what? It actually would have been better if I auto-generated this weight when it was in the position that I wanted it to be in, basically, like as a default. So real quick, let me change that. Okay, let's go in here and re-add this and auto-generate weights. Okay, so now I can show you what I mean a little bit already. It has added weights. We'll get into this a little bit more, but you should already be able to see some stretch and movement as this has been generated. Okay, but obviously it's not quite right. So that means that we're going to have to edit the weights. So to do that, we are going to go back into this mesh and you'll use this little tool here, weight. So this brings up kind of a value on all of these points. So it just depends how much you want these points affected by the different bones. So for example, this little section right here was moving a lot with this, and we don't want that to happen. So we want to decrease the weight that this bone has on those vertices. So you would select this bone that we want less of, and then the vertices that we want to be less affected, and we can just drag it down and it will have less weight. So you can manually change these weights so they may be more or less affected. And now I want these around the edge to be very affected by this. Now, if you have kind of blunt weights, like for example, if you have a fully orange weight in this case, and then there's a fully green one next to it, you're going to have a lot of stretching and it will not be as smooth as you might want it to be. Let me see if I can show an example of this. So see how maybe we might want a little bit of movement here, but not completely, so it just looks more smooth. But this is already looking a lot closer. We're not getting that gap anymore because it is shifting with the weight. So this definitely takes some practice to kind of have a good understanding, but I would encourage you to try it out for yourself. And with some practice, you should be able to make a pretty good weight. So when I first start doing this, what I originally do is just create the bone structure and then sort of go in and refine it as I work through it. And I did not record this entire process of how I do it. I usually kind of go in here and then change all of the names and stuff like that if I need to keep things clear. And then I go in and create meshes for everything and refine the weights. So I've already done quite a bit of this for this piece, and let's hop over to the other file where I can show you the IK constraint. All right, this is my finished piece actually. So first I'm going to show you how the IK constraint differs from the basic rotation. So when you're typically posing, you would use this little pose button up here, and you would just kind of rotate things around, and it should move like this. So mostly you are rotating individual joints, but you can use an IK constraint to change multiple at once. There's probably some rules for this that I don't quite understand. So this is kind of a early understanding of what an IK constraint does. There's probably some, details that would be better off explained by somebody else, but you have me, so you don't have that. All right, so these legs, because I want the legs, both of these to be associated, move at the same time by just moving the end of this. So if I move this around, both joints move, which is real nice, and they move really naturally. Well, except for this weight, it's messed up here, but we're not gonna talk about that part. So how you would do this, let's see. First of all, let me just delete this IK constraint and then we will recreate it. Yes, I want to delete. So what you would do is select all of the bones that you want associated with the IK constraint, which in this case I'm doing by first just clicking one and then control clicking the additional bone. And then you would just use this create IK constraint at the end of the bone button, and it will create an IK constraint at the end. You can't really see it because by default they start really small. So it should show up kind of at the bottom of, yeah, it's right here at the bottom. And you might want to increase this length to a higher length so you can kind of actually select this little guy. And then both should move. There you go. So that's an IK constraint. That's pretty much how you are going to move everything is by either rotating or using an IK constraint. You could also potentially do it for something like this by selecting these. Now I might not want this particular like the wrist joint to be associated, but I could move both of these by using an IK constraint, and that would just be the same thing right here. Again, I would increase this. And then you should be able to just move both at the one point instead of doing individual. Should be able to move things a little bit easier potentially instead of having to program out the specific bone rotations. So that's how most of this is going to go. The only exception I can really think of strange things that happen here is the face has some additional kind of detailing. So let's get into here. All right, so this head mesh, as you can see, it blinks. Well, maybe you can't see here, but you should be able to see in the animation. What I have done here is used basically the idea of a 3D model's face and how they use their vertices to animate smoothly. We have kind of the edge of the eye, and then you want some other ones to just help smooth out the blinking so it moves properly. So I created a mesh like this, and I decided, okay, I'm going to create bones for these individual sections that I want to move. There might be an easier way to do this, but if so, I don't know what it is. So in this case, I have created this little control over here, which basically operates the the eyes. So if I move this, it should go down at the top and up and down like this. It is a little finicky, but it definitely works. And yeah, I have created the eyes underneath on their own layer as well. So they should be able to also move. They have their own bone over here, so we can move the eye. I think it might be a bit redundant for me to explain a step-by-step of how to do this particular section, because most of this is going to be that you simply need to learn how to use weights, and most of that I think is going to come with practice and understanding the fundamentals, and I hope that I have explained well enough how weights and bones affect a mesh. But if it's a really new concept to you, it might be difficult to um, grasp without just getting in there and sort of experimenting. And once you understand the fundamentals, it's going to be pretty much really easy to apply that to anything. Okay, I'm going to give one more tip about how the bones connect to each other because it can get a little bit confusing if you're not aware of how this works. So, Bones are connected, in case that wasn't obvious. And what I mean by that is, let's say, okay, we have this arm here, and when I move the spine, this whole arm is, of course, going to move with it. It's not going to disconnect or anything. It's going to move with it. So that works because this bone is connected to this one. And it even shows that with these little arrows here. So you can see this is kind of the parent bone to all of these. And these go out. So this is important, especially when you are doing things like hair, because they might end up not being connected to what you need to connect them to. So when you're doing hair, you want to make sure that they are all connected to your head bone. So you can see right here, all of these hairs start here, and then they are sort of connected to each other, cascading down. So it's a good thing to be aware of that these also need to be attached to a certain thing. And I'll show you an example of what happens when they are not. When you are creating anything that is associated with a particular joint, like you want the head joint to, of course, affect all of the hair and dangling bits like that. So when you are creating a new bone, make sure that you have this bone selected. That's going to make it the parent bone. So there might be instances where you are creating hair and you're going boop, 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 and then you are going straight into the next one. So that's going to create a different kind of issue where they're not, the end of this bone will be affecting this one. Let me show you what I mean. I moved the bones so that now you can see with this little connector, this bone is actually the parent of this bone instead of the head as it should be. So that's going to create issues when I am moving this. It's going to affect that whole other section, which of course we don't want to do. So what if you have already done this and you're like, oh no, what do I do? It's actually a really simple fix. Just try and get the rotation so this piece is pretty much where you want it to be on its own. And then you would find this bone that needs to be disconnected, and you'll find the folder, or I'm not really sure if it's called a folder, but like the bone layer, I guess, armature that it shall show up in the side. And then you will want to find the parent bone that you actually want it to be connected to, which in this case is the head. So we have the head right here, and we have this guy right here, hair 1. So you just need to drag this hair 1 into the head armature, and that's going to make that the parent. So now it shall move, this won't affect that part, and it will move properly with the head. I hope that once you have these tools, you're able to create a full scene that should be animated fairly well. Just use meshes, and I can show you some more details about how these are created. Here is another mesh example for the torso, which is another big piece that needs a lot of bending. You can see I try to use vertices to break up certain parts that might need to move on its own. That will just give it a more natural look by having vertices at these borders like here. And the weights can get quite complicated. As you can see, a lot of bones are affecting this, and it can take quite a bit of trial and error to get these good. And hopefully I have some recording for this, so if you want to see my process, I will include that. So I'm just going to explain to you in depth the steps that I'm taking, and then you can sort of watch, and if you need to slow that down or watch what I do, that will also be there for you. Okay, if you're still with me through all of this, you should have a fully set up rig and you're now ready to finally go from the armature panel into the animation panel. This is where you will set up keyframes to animate your illustration or armature. So some basic setup things you're going to want to figure out is probably, I think by default, the FPS is set to 24. You might want to keep in mind a little bit about that having a higher FPS might show your errors a little bit more, but it will give you a smoother effect. You might just want to mess with the FPS. You might think, oh, 60 FPS is going to give me a super smooth, beautiful animation, and that might be true, but you also might benefit from having a lower FPS, which will give you maybe a little bit more of a hand-drawn effect, or it just kind of depends on what you're going for, so keep in mind that higher isn't always the best. I usually do 30 FPS and I don't really have a science behind it. I'm not really an animator, so there might be somebody in the comments going like, you should be at something else. And that could be true. But I've kind of stuck to 30 because it's an easy number for me to think about as far as how many keyframes there are and just kind of multiplying by threes. That kind of keeps it easy for me. So I also know that I want this to loop pretty evenly. So that means it's going to start and stop in the same spot. And typically I have done 180. So it's a pretty simple process. Again, I'm just going to go through kind of how I taught the rigging, where I'll show you what steps I take. And then keep in mind, you're going to have to do it for the whole thing. All right, hopefully this part is pretty simple. I'm just going to show you your way around this program, so you should be able to do an animation pretty simply. I'm just gonna start by making her arm move. So what I would do for this is I have the bone selected. I'm showing everything right now. You can also toggle your selections. So a good thing you might want to do is this little arrow right here. It allows things to be selectable or not. And you might want to turn off letting images be selectable. So you know how usually the meshes and all these images kind of come up and can be highlighted and selected. You're not going to really need this because we're animating everything via bones. So you can turn off that and it's going to make managing this workspace a little bit easier. You might also want to turn off having bones visible or not as you work on this animation, so you can actually see things without these bones in the way. For the most part, I'm just selecting things, and we will use the pose tool to move things around. This is in the top right, and you just kind of drag and click. It's a bit laggy because this is quite a large file. All right, so what I'm going to want to do is set a keyframe. So let's say that my starting position is right here. Doesn't really matter too much. We're going to set this. Oh, right. So every time you move, it's also going to reset this. So we're going to bring this down here. And we're going to set this keyframe by clicking this little flag icon. So this can be changed 3 different ways. You can move the selection, which isn't going to do a whole lot for most things that we just want to be rotated. That's not going to be too beneficial. If you have something that's a little more standalone, for example, a sparkle, you might want this to move up and down. But for most of these joint items, you're not probably going to want to use the move tool too much. You're going to stick mostly to rotating. You can also change the scale right here, which can be kind of crazy. And if you don't feel like clicking and dragging and feel like this is not very practical, you can always actually input the number, so have a little bit more control rather than they're kind of finicky dragging. So nothing's going to stay locked in place until we actually have a keyframe set here. So we're going to want to lock this rotation in using this flag icon, and that's going to create a keyframe for us. That's just going to lock that in place. Now, because I want it to loop, I am also going to go and jump over to the 180th frame. That's going to be where my animation changes. So this little box right here next to the C, it kind of tells you what your current frame is. I'm just going to put 180 in there. It's going to jump us over to 180 and lock it there as well. So anything I set in between these, I at least know that my loop is going to be good to go and stay correct. It can be annoying at times to kind of navigate this timeline. You can zoom in or out with this little plus and minus down here so we can see the whole timing. So pretty simply, let's say I just wanted her to move her hand back and forth. So let's put it, you know, kind of in the middle, and I'm just going to drag this down. Our rotation has changed, and I'm just going to set this keyframe. Now, when I play this, it's going to do, as you would expect, it's going to wave her arm back and forth. And it will loop by default, but just in case yours is not, it's this little repeat animation button down here at the bottom. So yeah, she's waving her hand, looks very much like a Christmas animatronic at the moment. So you're probably going to want to learn or think about some kind of basic principles of animation. What makes animation good is usually messing with timing and kind of speeding and slowing things up to give emotion a more natural and effective animation. So we can do this a couple of different ways. Of course, you can do it manually. So let's say I want her to wave kind of slowly and then speed up a little bit at the end. You would just go in the middle of these two. We're going to create a keyframe kind of in the middle here. So this hasn't really changed anything. It's just locking in place what was there before. But if I drag this down, it's going to kind of speed up, or no, slow down. It's going to kind of slow down the timing of things. So let's see how that looks. It's going to change things a little bit. It'll be kind of slow and then fast. Slow, speeds up. So you can move these around as you like. But this is also a little, you know, time consuming. You have to manually move this around. It, you know, does its own pros and cons. So another thing we're going to want to touch on for sure, this is kind of your secret sauce for getting these animations to look good, is this little curve editor over here. And for the most part, you're not going to really need to mess with it too much unless you want to get into anything intricate. They kind of have these presets down here at the bottom, and they kind of tell you what they do as well. So linear is kind of what we're on right now. It just is a very straightforward animation, but you can make it so it kind of eases into the animation, eases out, or it does both. So this is going to change some things. Let's set these to be ease both. Both of these, you would just click the little keyframe and then hit this curve. And it will change kind of how the timing of it looks. So it's kind of going slowly, rocking into it, and easing back out. I'll put that side by side to the without right here. So that's pretty much what you are going to be doing for animating this whole thing, is just rotating these pieces around and messing with them, getting their timing right. And you pretty much have the basics down of how to animate something. So that's pretty much the tools. And like before, I'm going to include my process of what I have of it. I haven't recorded the whole thing, but that's probably good, or this video would be like 3 hours long, and it's already quite a long video. So I hope that that gives you some resources, and here we go. Okay, so once you have everything animated, you have a full animation, how do we actually get it out of Dragonbones? First thing you're going to want to do is set a canvas size, because while you're animating, some of these pieces can go outside of the canvas area. So with just the regular, like nothing particular selected on the left, there will be a properties window and you just want to check canvas. And then make your width and height appropriate to whatever you sort of planned, maybe whatever your PSD file is, that should work. You might want to make it a little bit smaller if some of your pieces are too close to the edge. The next thing you're going to want to do is go to File, Export. It'll come up with this little window that says multiple textures or scale or however you want to do it. If you have a big file, it doesn't really matter what you check because it's not going to affect what we're doing. So what you're going to want to do is go to the Image tab at the top. And this will mostly probably be default, but there's a couple things to keep in mind. You're going to want it to be a sequence PNG under the type and format. Your FPS should match whatever you've been doing for your animation. For image contains, you should probably set it to canvas, which is what we just set up, so there's no overlapping stuff outside of the picture. The background color probably doesn't matter if you have a background that's already inside of your animation, but if you want to separate anything, it might be a good thing to keep in mind that you can set it to transparent since it's in PNG. So if you want to separate anything for, having animated layers in a program like After Effects or something that you want to edit later, and then you just want to make a folder for those exported PNGs. I've done a little bit of research on how you can make PNG sequences into videos, but I haven't actually tried anything out except for in Adobe After Effects. But there definitely are some ways that you can compile things like this, like PNG sequences outside of After Effects. I think there's probably even some converters online. So if you don't have After Effects, that might be something to look into, but I will show you how to do it in After Effects just in case that interests you. So there's nothing too special about this. I'm just on a new composition in the same file size as my PNG sequence. And I'm just going to right click on this panel to the left here and hit import. Then I'm going to want to import multiple files, and in that folder I'm just going to hit Control A to select all. And then we're just going to make sure that PNG sequence is checked and import that. Then you'll have this PNG sequence that you can just drag onto the timeline, and your animation will be in After Effects. After Effects has a lot more exporting options compared to something like Dragonbones, so you should be able to put it out into an AVI file or maybe an MP4 or whatever works for you. I also do some additional editing, usually in Premiere Pro, so I kind of do some rendering and stuff like that. For this particular piece, I did do some additional effects in After Effects. However, I'm really super still learning After Effects, and I feel like YouTube has already covered a lot of effects and there's such a wide range. So I would suggest just searching for anything you might want to add in After Effects if you're curious about that part of it. Wow, we have made it to the end. This was a monster of a tutorial for me to film and edit, but hopefully, even if it helps just one person out there make a really cool splash animation or whatever you want to do, that works for me. This is really a special occasion because I have also decided to share some files of mine to help you guys along with this tutorial. So that is going to include my PSD and my Dragonbones. I'm sharing this all for free. This is kind of a rarity, and I just want to say a big shout out to all of my patrons. Usually my Patreon subscribers are the only people that get access to my PSDs, and they're really the reason that I'm able to do this and set time aside to share tutorials like this. So big thank you. I'm going to make a list of everybody that's on the learning tier and above and just say thank you, thank you, thank you. If you are interested in more tutorials from me, more in-depth things like that, if you like my teaching style, please let me know. If you have more questions about anything that you think is in my wheelhouse, I am happy to do it. But do keep in mind that it takes a lot of my time, so if you're interested in giving me a tip or anything like that, check out my Patreon. I will share it below. Happy creating. Show me what you make. If you get some use out of this, that would be awesome. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks so much.